I'll never forget the heartfelt conversation I had with my father on the evening I announced my engagement to Stephen. He had been quiet throughout dinner, his usual warm demeanor tempered by a thoughtful silence that hinted at something deeper. Afterward, he gestured for me to join him in the study, a room filled with the comforting scent of old books and the soft glow of a vintage lamp. "I need to ask you something," he began, his voice steady but laced with concern. "Are you absolutely certain about this decision to marry Stephen?" I was taken aback. I had expected congratulations, maybe a proud smile or a fatherly embrace. Instead, I was met with doubt. "I love him, Dad," I said, my voice firm but puzzled. "He's kind, respectful, and supportive." "What's wrong?" My father sighed and leaned back in his chair, his eyes searching mine for understanding. "It's not that I don't believe you care for him, or that he doesn't treat you well. But sometimes, love can blind us to what's right in front of us. There's something about Stephen, and his mother, that doesn't sit right with me. Call it a father's instinct." His words stung, and I immediately rushed to Stephen's defense. "He's affectionate, hardworking, and devoted to me. What more could I ask for?" But my father wasn't deterred. "Have you noticed how often he talks about your wealth? About your family's home, the trips you've taken, or the things you've bought? It's subtle, but I've seen it. He seems more impressed by what you have than by who you are. That's not how a man should think of his partner." I hesitated, unsure of how to respond. Deep down, I knew my father wasn't someone who spoke lightly of these things. He had always been protective of me, especially after my mother passed away. Still, I couldn't accept what he was implying. "Dad, you're overthinking this," I insisted. "Stephen loves me for me. I wouldn't be with him otherwise." He didn't argue further, but the concern in his eyes lingered, even as he hugged me tightly before I left. At the time, I dismissed his words as overprotectiveness, a father struggling to let go of his little girl. I was blinded by love and, if I'm honest, desperate to hold on to a sense of stability. Losing my mother 3 years earlier had left a void in my life, one I thought Stephen could help fill. My father's health had also begun to decline, and I was acutely aware that time with him was slipping away. I wanted to believe that marrying Stephen would give me the family I so deeply craved. Stephen and his mother, Megan, came from a modest background, a stark contrast to the comfortable life my father had built for us through years of hard work and smart investments. I thought our differences in upbringing didn't matter, but over time, I began to notice things I had previously ignored. When Stephen and Megan moved into my small townhouse after our wedding, they didn't express gratitude or excitement. Instead, they lamented its size compared to my father's sprawling mansion. "It's such a shame," Megan said one evening. "With your dad living in such a grand place, you ended up with this compact house." I explained, somewhat defensively, that I was a regular office worker with a modest income and that even affording this house had been a stretch, made possible only with my father's help on the down payment. But Megan wasn't satisfied. "Well," she suggested, "surely your father could buy you something bigger. Or did your mother leave you nothing when she passed? That seems unfair." Her casual entitlement struck a nerve. "Whatever my mother left is rightfully my father's," I replied firmly. "And I'm perfectly content with what I have." Stephen, however, chimed in with a bold suggestion: "Your dad should just swap houses with us. He's living alone in that big place, and we could really use the space." I was appalled. "Absolutely not. That's his home. He deserves to live there comfortably for as long as he wants." Their response was chilling. "Well," Megan said with a smirk, "he's not going to be around forever. When the time comes, you'll inherit it anyway." The ease with which they spoke about my father's death, and their eagerness to plan for an inheritance, sent a shiver down my spine. Even worse was their insistence that I should ask my father for more money, despite us not being in financial trouble. When my father passed away from cancer a year later, I was devastated. My grief was compounded by the cold indifference of Stephen and Megan. They barely acknowledged my loss, offering no comfort or support. Instead, their focus shifted entirely to my father's will. "Why can't we be at the reading?" Stephen demanded angrily when I told him it was a private matter. He was my father-in-law. I have a right to know what he left behind. Megan chimed in, her voice dripping with entitlement. It's absurd to exclude family. Stephen should have some claim, as your husband. The lawyer's response was curt and final. Mr. Lawrence's will does not mention Stephen or Megan. Only his daughter. Their reaction was a mix of outrage and disbelief. For the first time, I saw their true colors fully exposed. They weren't mourning the loss of a father-in-law, they were mourning the loss of an opportunity. Reflecting on those events, I can't help but hear my father's voice echoing in my mind. He had seen through Stephen and Megan long before I did, warning me of the selfishness and greed I had been too blinded by love to see. What I thought was love and family turned out to be something far more hollow. My father's instinct had been right all along. I was heartbroken, but I knew that if I wanted to reclaim my life, I had to find the strength to move forward from this betrayal. Stephen, however, seemed utterly unbothered by the devastation he had caused. His response was chillingly pragmatic, devoid of remorse or even the pretense of affection. I married you, he began bluntly, his tone unsettlingly matter-of-fact, because I thought it would secure a comfortable life for me and my mom. We've always struggled financially, and I didn't have many options. I didn't go to college, had no career prospects, and couldn't see a way out of our situation. I thought marrying you would change all that, your family's wealth, your inheritance. It seemed like the perfect solution. His candid admission hit me like a punch to the gut. I stared at him, waiting for some glimmer of regret or apology, but he continued as if he were discussing a business decision rather than the betrayal of someone who had loved and trusted him. It was the only way I thought I could give my mom the life she deserves, he said, his voice calm and calculated. But now that I see there's no inheritance, I realize my efforts were pointless. Mom's right, I need to move forward and keep searching for something better. I felt the ground shift beneath me, his words cutting deeper than I thought possible. He had feigned love, orchestrated a facade of affection, all for the promise of wealth that never materialized. As he and Megan began to vent their frustrations, about the lack of money, about how their plans had gone awry, I found myself tuning them out. Their voices became a distant hum as my thoughts spiraled, trying to process the enormity of their deceit. The anger simmered within me, growing hotter with every word they spoke. I wanted to scream, to lash out, to unleash the storm of betrayal and heartbreak they had caused, but I didn't. Instead, I forced myself to remain calm, channeling my fury into composure. Okay then, Stephen, I said, my voice steady but icy, if a divorce is what you want, then that's what you'll get. I've never been one to deny your requests, so consider this a final favor. Megan, always quick to escalate, chimed in with her usual venom. And don't think for a second you can take alimony from my son. We'll fight you tooth and nail before you see a cent of that. I turned to her, my expression firm. Don't worry, Megan, I don't want alimony, nor do I want anything from Stephen. Here's what I propose, a mutual divorce with no division of assets or financial claims. You don't have much, and neither do I at the moment. Let's part ways cleanly. Stephen, ever pragmatic, agreed to the terms without hesitation. The conversation became purely transactional, devoid of any emotional connection. It was as if our entire relationship had been reduced to a business deal. For them, this was a simple end to an unprofitable investment. For me, it was the beginning of reclaiming my freedom. As the details of the divorce were ironed out, I noticed Megan's behavior shift. She barely acknowledged me, her disinterest a clear indication that I was no longer of any use to her. This only solidified my resolve to end the marriage swiftly. I made arrangements for Stephen and Megan to move out of my house and into a rented apartment nearby. They settled in without protest, and as the divorce proceedings progressed, Stephen held up his end of the agreement. He made no claim on my house, and I didn't seek alimony. It was a straightforward exchange, one that felt more like a business transaction than the dissolution of a marriage. But behind my composed facade, I was unraveling. Each day, I found myself crying in the car before and after work, the tears flowing uncontrollably as I grappled with the weight of their betrayal. Stephen and Megan didn't notice. They were too preoccupied with their own frustrations to see the toll their actions had taken on me. On the day our divorce was finalized, I decided to take one last step to close this chapter of my life. I visited their rented apartment, clutching my wedding and engagement rings. When Stephen opened the door, I held the rings out to him. I just wanted to return these, I said firmly. This marriage brought nothing but distress into my life, and I prefer not to keep any reminders of it. Megan appeared behind Stephen, her expression smug. Are you sure? She sneered. You might need the money. It's funny, you always look down on our poverty, and now look at you. My son's being generous letting you keep the rings. You might want to sell them when your job falls through. Her words stung, but I refused to let her see my pain. Instead, I laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that caught them both off guard. Why would I need to sell the rings? Megan, don't feel embarrassed for me. We already know my parents left me nothing, they lost it all to poor decisions, right? My laughter unsettled them, and I could see the confusion in their eyes. Perhaps they were starting to realize that I was no longer the naive woman they had manipulated. As I turned to leave, I felt a sense of liberation. Their baffled faces were a clear sign they hadn't grasped the full extent of my resilience. For the first time in years, I felt the weight of their deceit begin to lift, and I walked away knowing I was free.